Okay, so welcome back to Humanistic Psychology here at the University of West Georgia. This video will be the fourth video in a series about getting started in humanistic psychology. In our last video, what we did was we examined the philosophical foundation of natural science modes of psychology, and what we're going to do in this video is do a very parallel analysis with respect to humanistic psychology. So, humanistic psychology, basic datum. Instead of being empirically verifiable observations of the objective world, as was the case in natural science modes of psychology, the basic datum here is going to be people's experience of the world. And I put the word experience in big block letters, not because it's a fancy vocabulary word that I didn't think you would know, but simply because it's so important. And as we get into this analysis, you'll probably see even more clearly why it's so important. People's experience of the world. Hence, the world is seen as inseparable from people's experience of it. So, whereas in the case of natural science modes of psychology, we had the idea that, well, the objective world is in some sense separable from our subjective experience of it, such that we can examine that objective world and come to insights and truths about it that have a objective validity. Here, the supposition is that the objective world and our subjective experience of it are always in a mutual, reciprocal, ongoingly unfolding relationship with each other. Okay, consequently, humanistic psychology sees reality in terms of a monism, and that is a vocabulary word that maybe you don't know right now. So before, when we were examining in the last video, natural science modes of psychology, we described their account of reality in terms of a dualism. And of course, the dualism had to do with the idea that reality is ultimately all the elements of the objectively verifiable world added to all the elements of our subjective experience. Here, the two are in a much more intimate, much more interwoven relationship with each other. They are not regarded as separable at all. So a monism means an account of reality in terms of one fundamental thing instead of a dualism, which is an account of reality in terms of two fundamental things. So the one fundamental thing, of course, is the holistic unitary interrelationship between subjectivity and objectivity. So from this point of view, it's more like there's an objective side to reality and a subjective side to reality, but ultimately what we're looking at is a fundamentally unitary thing. Okay, so it's more like self-world or something like that, or being in the world. Okay, so that's the basis of reality from this point of view. An implication, let's draw out a couple implications. Causality, therefore, is just one aspect or one possible account of our experience of life rather than an all-encompassing, inescapable determinism. So we saw from a natural science point of view, at least the Newtonian natural science point of view, that natural science modes of psychology tend to adopt. In that case, causality is the only game in town, as it were, and as a consequence, things like your freedom and your responsibility and in a way the meaning of your experience tend to evaporate. They tend to disappear. Why? Because all that's really happening is cause and effect operating in a certain kind of tricky way that makes us think that we're free, but really all of our choices are preordained by causes that lie outside of ourselves. All right, so here that's not going to be the case. Okay, so causality is only one possible element of our lives. And you may wonder, because we live in a culture that more or less venerates and perhaps idolizes a causal deterministic view of reality, what the other alternatives could possibly be. Well, Carl Jung, for one, had a different idea about what might be operative in the universe other than causality in his idea of synchronicity. Okay, so synchronicity, according to Jung, is the idea that events could be connected acausally. All right, which means not causally. Acausally means not causally, okay? So, but connected nonetheless in some important, significant sense. All right, so that would be one idea of a possible alternative dynamic to a causally deterministic view of reality. Okay, so, all right, so Instead of simply swallowing a causal account without asking too much about it, humanistic psychology usually proceeds, oh my goodness, look at that long word in your notes. How are you ever going to learn to say that? Here's how to say it, phenomenologically. Okay, so this is going to have to do with phenomenology, which is, as you'll see in the next few videos for sure, going to occupy a pretty important role in humanistic psychology. Now, here's the thing about that long, somewhat tricky word, phenomenology or phenomenologically or any of its cognates. We're going to be using that word, unfortunately, in three different ways. And I wish that there were separate vocabulary words to make your learning task easier, but the fact of the matter is people use that word in several different ways, and you have to sort of know that there are several different ways in order to really understand what people are saying when they talk about phenomenology. Okay, so this is the first time in this class we're encountering this word. And so let's give it the simplest meaning possible, and as we go on in the next few videos, we're going to give other renditions of it that are definitely more technical and more complicated. But the first use of the word is as in a very rough and approximate way of describing the process of realizing and articulating the meaning of people's experience. Okay, so to be understanding things phenomenologically means that you're going to be looking at people's everyday experience and in one way or another trying to have some sort of insight about its meaning or significance. Okay, so because this is a little counterintuitive for students, I feel like I have to repeat it several times to get you sort of used to it. So once again, at the risk of possibly boring you, this use of the word phenomenology has to do with looking at our everyday experience of life and somehow trying to have a realization about what its psychological meaning is. Okay, so notice that this is a way of affirming what we said at the beginning of the video, that the fundamental datum of humanistic psychology is going to be people's experience. Okay, so phenomenology is all about examining experience and then trying to realize the meaning of it. Okay. As a consequence of this, in other words, this is the fact that humanistic psychology proceeds phenomenologically, it also proceeds qualitatively. Okay, kind of another long word. Actually, this word is not that tricky, all right, because it kind of has the word quality embedded in it, all right. So what it's going to be looking at, because it's proceeding phenomenologically, is the various qualities of people's experience. It's going to be interrogating the qualities of people's experience. Well, the thing about the qualities of people's experience is that, for the most part, if you ask people what they're experiencing, they will not describe it in terms of numbers or arithmetic or mathematical equations. They will not speak that language. What they'll speak is a natural language like English or whatever, German or French or Spanish or something like that. In other words, languages that are spoken in the everyday. So what this means is that if you're going to be proceeding qualitatively, for the most part, you're going to be examining, the thing you're going to be looking at is people's descriptions of their experience in regular language. In other words, the whole enterprise is going to be about analyzing things like speech acts and that sort of thing, rather than analyzing, you know, counting up behaviors and manipulating equations and stuff like that. So it's going to be speaking a different language from a lot of mainstream psychology. Okay, so a lot of mainstream psychology is not qualitative in nature, it's quantitative in nature. And I'm sort of emphasizing those words so you can hear them to make them easier for you. Because if you're proceeding quantitatively, that means that you're going to be looking at quantities of things, implication counting things up or measuring things somehow numerically, and then manipulating equations that describe the interrelationships between what it is you're counting and measuring. Okay, that's what it is to proceed quantitatively. If you're going to be proceeding qualitatively, like you would be doing if you're doing a form of phenomenology, you're going to be working in natural languages like English, for instance, you know. Okay, so a couple new vocabulary words. They're not that hard. the word phenomenology is a little bit trickier. I'll give you that. But qualitatively means in terms of qualities, implication in terms of natural languages. Quantitatively means in terms of quantities. In other words, in terms of things you can count and measure. Therefore, the language is going to be mathematical. All right? So, implication. In the case of the natural science modes of psychology, we saw that they like to focus on the question why, which, as we saw in the last video, is a very causally laden question, right? Because the question why is about asking for explanations of things that you've observed in the world in terms of the antecedents that have brought those things about, the causal antecedents that have produced those things, okay? So that's the question why. We're just remembering for a second something from the last video, so this should not be a new learning for you. So instead of asking why so often, humanistic psychology likes to ask what and how. Okay, so let's sort of elaborate on that to help you understand it a little better. So instead of asking so much like why does X happen, doesn't matter what the X is, all right? Humanistic psychology will ask questions like, what are you experiencing and how are you experiencing it? Okay, so there, once again, there's that very strong emphasis on people's experience. I told you that word experience is going to crop up again and again in this particular video, and probably, well, actually throughout the entire semester, to be honest about it. But we're really emphasizing it for the first time right now. So, okay, so natural science modes of psychology, let's summarize for a second, tend to focus much more on the question why. Why do they do that? Because they tend to view reality in terms of a causal determinism, and the question why is the question that interrogates things in terms of a causal determinism, all right? Humanistic psychology, because it emphasizes experience and the meaning of experience so much, tends to ask questions much more like, what are you experiencing and how are you experiencing it? Okay, so a real different direction, you know, relative to the differences in their philosophical foundations. All right, so... All right, now in the previous video what we did was we looked at a bunch of advantages of natural science modes of psychology, and we looked at a bunch of disadvantages of it. And I said to you when we did that in the last video, these things are only going to appear to you to be advantages and disadvantages insofar as you're able to adopt a perspective from which they will appear to be advantages and disadvantages. In other words, like if you're able to put one foot in a natural science point of view, then all of a sudden the advantages will seem to be advantages. If you're not able to do that, then they won't seem to be very advantageous in the first place. On the other hand, when we saw the disadvantages of the natural science paradigm, I said to you something like, these are only going to appear to you to be disadvantages insofar as you're able to put at least one foot or one toe in the water of humanistic psychology. Okay, same deal here, all right? Same deal here. So that same sort of logic of these things may or may not appear to you to be advantages or disadvantages, depending upon whether you're able to adopt the proper perspective. So with that warning in mind, let's dig into this. Okay, so advantages of a humanistic perspective, the advantages of doing psychology in a more or less phenomenological, qualitative type way. Oh my God, I'm using some of your new vocabulary. Yes, I am so happy that you are such a quick freaking study that you've already absorbed it. God bless you, each and every one. Okay, so advantages of proceeding in a humanistic psychological way. It tends to produce understandings that speak to people's experience. Oh, big shock. The whole thing is based on examining people's experience. So it's pretty much straightforward that the kind of insights we'll have will tend to speak to people's experience much more quickly and much more directly, which is a problem that we saw in the natural science modes of psychology when I was talking about so what psychology. All right, and I was saying that, you know, one of the problems of natural science psychology is that it tends to generate a lot of trivial truths, like a trivial insights that are correct, but that are merely correct. Well, the thing about humanistic psychology, one of the advantages is because it centers itself on people's experience of actual life, it tends to be able to speak the language of life much more fluently and much more directly for a larger segment of the population. Okay, so because it's able to do that, because it's able to speak more directly to our everyday experience of life. Why? Because it's based upon our everyday experience of life. It has the power to help us grow and change in how we see things and to change our lives ultimately, not just for the sort of few people at the top of the pyramid, as it were, who are able to speak the language of natural science psychology, but for a much larger and a much more egalitarian segment of the population. All right, egalitarian, maybe you don't know that word. That means sort of like classless. So it's not so all about sort of the upper, whatever, 1% of the elite, and they get the insights and no one else does. All right, so it's much more accessible to people in general. Okay, so it has the power to change life for the better by emphasizing our experience of possibly, experiencing the magic of life, the miraculous nature of life, because that's part of our experiential complement too, all right? So, and so at the end of the previous video, I was asking you the question, like, how do you see life? How do you see reality? And I said something like, that's going to be really important to, finding your way and your direction within psychology, or whether you even should be a psychology major in the first place. So if you see life in a certain way, that's going to predispose you to certain kinds of psychology. If you see it in another way, that's going to predispose you to other kinds of psychology. That was from the last video, so if you missed that one, you might want to watch the last video. Well, and then I said at the end, like, I prefer to see life as, powerful and poetic and like magical and adventurous and like an ongoingly miraculous unfolding of universal transcendence. And that's how I prefer to see life. So I like ways of understanding that tend to amplify that tend to enhance that. That's me. But like I said in the last video, or I guess this was 2 videos ago, the big question is, how do you see life? All right. Okay, so it has the power to change life for the better by emphasizing the inherent magic and power of our lives. Why? Because it's speaking to our experience of life. Okay. All right, so those are advantages if you're able to at least put one toe in the water of something like a humanistic psychological perspective. If you can stop worshiping exclusively at the temple of the objective sciences and actually honor your subjective experience every now and then, those things might appear to be advantages. Okay, so now what about disadvantages or problems? And this is going to be from the perspective of natural science psychology and perhaps from the much larger perspective of our predominant cultural values and habits. So, first problem with humanistic psychology. It's not traditionally scientific. It's too subjective. This is one of the complaints about it. In sort of honoring experience and basing itself on examining people's experience and trying to illuminate the meanings of people's experience, it falls into a kind of abyss, I guess from some people's point of view, of being too subjective, not rigorous enough. It's not enough like chemistry. It's not enough like physics is the essence of this complaint. Consequently, it shouldn't be believed by people, and more specifically by people who only buy what traditional science says as the truth. Okay, so there are a fair number of people like that in our culture. Like, if it's not sort of traditionally scientific and, logically coherent in a very rigidified sense, like, people aren't going to be able to find much value in it, is the essence of the complaint. But, as Shakespeare once put it, well, there's more in heaven and earth than is dreamt of in that philosophy. Oh my goodness, that's a line from Hamlet, all right? So there's more in heaven and earth, there's more in life than is dreamt of in the philosophy of, a rigidified adherence to the paradigm of the Newtonian natural sciences, and consequently natural science psychology. There's more to life than that. Well, if there's more to life than that, maybe psychology should be open to examining what that more is. Okay, so that's the first complaint. Second complaint, it doesn't solve enough problems. Okay, so humanistic psychology is not very sort of problem-centered in a way. It's not. Why is humanistic psychology like that? Because it centers itself on experience and exploring the terrain of experience. Well, sometimes we experience problems in our lives, but a lot of the time we don't. All right. So what that means is that humanistic psychology, yes, will spend some time on exploring people's experience of various sorts of problems, like categories that come up to us from the DSM, like different kinds of psychological disturbances that people have, like mood disorders or anxiety disorders or psychotic breaks or what have you, personality disorders, etc. Like they will explore those in terms of people's experience, but they'll explore a whole other side of life. The whole other side of life has to do with how life is not necessarily problematic, but sometimes you're having a good time. Well, guess what? Humanistic psychologists are interested in that too. Like sometimes you're not just dealing with problems, sometimes you're sort of rising above norms, and growing and becoming all that you can be, and having wild, interesting, powerful peak experiences, and engaging in artistic creation. Well, guess what? Humanistic psychology is interested in all that too. But the problem from this point of view is that it's not spending all its time solving problems. Well, the rejoinder to that would be, yeah, but is solving problems all there is to life? Because from a humanistic point of view, it's not. It's just one part of life, but there are many other parts of life that are not necessarily problem-centered. And wouldn't you be interested in those as psychologists too? Okay, that would be the rejoinder to that complaint. Okay, now at this point, we have finished our compare and contrast operation, and what I'd like to do for the last segment of this video is explore a little bit about how humanistic psychologists think about meaning, because we've already glossed the phenomenological impulse of humanistic psychology as examining everyday experience with an eye toward revealing its meaning. Okay, so the meaning of our experience of life is what humanistic psychology is about. Okay, so revealing the meaning of our experience of life. So we have to talk a little bit about the meaning of meaning, as it were. And you might think, wow, that seems to be inviting an infinite regress of some kind. Well, yeah, but what's the alternative? To completely ignore the question of how the meaning of our experience. So it's all right. Take a chill pill, man. Okay, so meaning. Let's talk about how humanistic psychologists think about meaning. Okay, what's going to happen here is there's going to be actually two layers or levels of meaning, and they're going to more or less map onto what we've already just described, but there's going to be some specialized vocabulary. Okay, so first level of meaning, a kind of implicit level of meaning, slowing down to give you time to absorb some of the new vocabulary, a kind of implicit meaning in our everyday experience of life, even before we engage the project of trying to figure out what the sort of the higher level of meaning of it is. Okay, so the idea here is that everyday experience of life is already meaningful, but it's meaningful in an implicit way. It's not as though we're necessarily thematically aware of it. Okay, so, and this is counterintuitive. This may be a little counterintuitive for you at first. Your everyday life is already meaningful. Okay, it's not just sort of random and spastic and aleatory. No, there's a fancy vocabulary word for you. So aleatory is just a fancy way of saying governed by random chance. Okay, from the Latin word alia, which is a word that means dice in Latin, right? So alia jacta est, if you've read Julius Caesar in the original Latin. All right, so that's a little bit of a tangent, I suppose, but hey, come on, cut me a break. Anyhow, so a level of implicit meaning insofar as life is already meaningful. Okay, some fancy vocabulary to attach to this. This is sometimes known as the phenomenal layer of meaning. Okay, so here we have to sort of disambiguate a little bit. So we have the regular word phenomenal in English, which means something like, oh, great or wonderful or something like that. That's not this word. Okay, this is a technical word. Okay, so don't defer too quickly to the regular English word phenomenal. Okay, so this is something very specific that means everyday life before you reflect upon it. Okay, so sometimes this level of meaning is called pre-reflective. Before you engage in reflection to try to figure out its sort of higher order meaning, the idea is that even at the phenomenal level of our everyday experience, life is, in a sense, already something meaningful. And by the way, if you need sort of an indicator of how this might be true, think about how your body normally moves, right? Even if you're not reflecting about it, and how 99.9% of the time your body is moving in a very coherent, sensible relation to the physical demands of the world around you. Yeah, every now and then you make a mistake and you trip and you bump into something, but that's actually like 0.1% of the time that you do that. Most of the time you're walking around, you're walking through doors, you're stepping over things, you're gesticulating like I am now in a more or less sensible, coherent relation to world. Well, if your body's moving in a sensible, coherent relation to world, in a sense, there's a kind of meaningful orientation of your body with respect to the demands of the world. Even if you're not reflecting upon it, you're not having some higher order of insight, your life is already meaningful. You get it? It's already expressive, in a sense, of your relation to world. Okay, so that's an indicator of that. And then the second layer of meaning is what we've been sort of, I guess, describing a little bit by way of contrast, the kind of meaning that we make explicit. So when we look at our everyday experience of, our phenomenal everyday experience of life, okay? And then we wonder about it and we reflect upon it and we have an insight about it at that higher level, as it were, of meaning. We make it explicit, okay? By way of reflection and interpretation. This is, and here comes the second meaning of this word, known as the phenomenological level of meaning. Okay, so I'm slowing down for a second to give you a couple seconds to digest the idea that, oh, this is a little bit more of a technical meaning of that word phenomenological. Okay, it's the same word, but we're using it in a somewhat more technical way. All right, yeah, we are. And it's to refer technically to the level of meaning that you would be sort of aware of as meaning. Okay, so one way of getting a handle on this is phenomenal is everyday life. Phenomenological is sort of realizing at the level of awareness and articulation the significance of everyday life. Okay, so slowing down, because I know this can be sort of tricky to get a hold on. Now, here's the next trick. Humanistic psychology, and phenomenology more generally, sees these two levels, okay, the phenomenal level and the phenomenological level, or, to put it in other words, the level of implicit everyday meaning and the level of explicit reflective type meaning as fundamentally interrelated. Okay, so one way of talking about that is they are bidirectionally interrelated. Bidirectional means the influence goes both ways. So the phenomenal level of meaning is going to be influencing the phenomenological level of meaning, and the phenomenological level of meaning is going to be influencing the phenomenal level of meaning. Okay, the first one of those is probably more obvious, because when we say that, well, humanistic psychology is about reflecting upon our everyday experience in order to have some sort of insight about its significance, all right, that seems pretty obvious that, well, anything that is on the level of our reflective awareness of significance is going to be based on our everyday experience of life. So the idea that the phenomenal level of meaning is going to be shaping and influencing meaning at the phenomenological level, that's kind of straightforward and intuitive, but it's maybe a little less intuitive that it works the other way around. Okay, so that second arc is also going on. The phenomenological level of meaning is also influencing the phenomenal level of meaning. So why is that? Because when you have a realization at the level of your reflective awareness, that's just another moment of your life. You're not abstracting yourself out or pulling yourself out of the world in order to have that realization. You have that realization exactly from the point of view of continuing your life. Consequently, when you have a realization like that, it can't help but, perhaps in subtle or perhaps dramatic ways, influence how you experience life in the everyday. Okay, so that's why it's a bidirectional interplay. It's not just that, well, the phenomenal level influences whatever realization you have at the phenomenological level. That seems pretty straightforward. It's also the case that realizations and insights you have at the phenomenological level are going to bear back upon how you experience life in the everyday. And like I said, it could be subtle, or it could be, sometimes it's dramatic, like you realize something important about your damn life, and it influences and changes how you experience your life. You know, sometimes it can change the whole damn direction of your life, for that matter, and hopefully it does. Like, especially if you're young, you know, especially if you're young and you're sort of, you know, you're just sort of getting your hands and feet on the ladder of adult life. You know, yeah, sometimes you have moments of realization that alter your entire sense for what the damn game is. You know, like you come into new values, or you let go of old values, or you change your mind about things, or you change your beliefs, like you come into some deeper insight about things. And hell yeah, you know, that's part of the adventure of being young. It's also the part of the adventure of being my age too. So you don't have to let go of that as you get older. All appearances to the contrary. All right, so there's this bidirectional interplay. So another way of saying the same thing, to ride in parallel with your notes, humanistic psychology seeks to understand life. Okay, that's the first obvious arc, but also to change life. And that's where it gets really interesting. Like seeking out the kinds of understandings that have the power to change us. Because that's really the deep nature of the project, you know, to seek out the kinds of insights, the kinds of realizations that have the power to bear back on how we experience life in the everyday, which is to say, 99% of our lives are spent in the everyday mode, you know. Yeah, to enhance the depth of that. Yeah, to enhance the quality of that. To make your life an adventure. Why not? Like, why shouldn't psychology be about making your life more of an adventure? I know, right? You know? Oh, my God. So, all right, so not every kind of psychology tries to do that, though. Sometimes psychology is much more content with just, well, if you have a couple realizations, you can sort of close up shop and begin your weekend. Well, humanistic psychology has the other idea that the whole point of realizing things about the human psyche is to actually change how we're alive in the world. You know, and why the hell not? Okay, so last little bit before we end this video. After all, what does our understanding really matter if it doesn't ultimately change life somehow? You know, if our understanding is all just sort of about, you know, sort of dwelling in some kind of, you know, sort of isolated ivory tower that's fundamentally separate and distant from the regular run of life, then what the hell does it really matter? I mean, how much value does it really have if that's all there is to it? Like, really, the whole project of understanding things only attains its proper power and its proper significance when it begins to have the power not to be just another mode of so what psychology, but to bear back directly and importantly on how we experience life itself. Okay, so that's enough for this video. In the next video, we're going to be talking quite a bit about research and what qualitative, new vocabulary word, research begins to look like. But until then, have a great day, have a wonderful one, take care.